As Taskin writes, film is ideologically and culturally loaded. What is portrayed in film matters, both because of the ideas it takes from culture and its representing those ideas. Unfortunately, Western film industry has a long history of representing and perpetuating derogatory and harmful stereotypes of those oppressed by mainstream society, one of the largest groups of which are people of color. For a long time, and into modern film, the roles of actual ethnic minorities in mainstream film were limited to stereotypical stock characters. These characters appeared mostly as comic relief or as antagonists. They are almost always, until more recent cinema, othered to serve these purposes. Taskin defines the concept of othering thusly: those who are unable to abstract in the same recognizable manner of the European philosophical tradition are others. Likewise, this creates a binarily imposed view that to be human was to attain this identity. In a world dissected binarily but simultaneously around identity, there is an identity which can be seen as the pure form, and there is an other that is not fulfilling these criteria. This has the most influence when one group has significant power over the other, through colonization or enslavement, for example. Because they were and are so widespread, they are instantly recognizable as opposed to the true people and cultures they represent, which are rich and diverse. While this fulfills the purpose of these simplified caricatures, it also does not provide any meaningful representation. Blackface, at least, was popularized in live performances in the United States, such as minstrel shows. Hornback notes, in his article, The Folly of Racism, Enslaving Blackface and the Natural Fool Tradition, that while in Western religion and culture, the color black was associated with evil, comedy shows such as these associated blackness with degradation, irrationality, prideful lack of self-knowledge, transgression, and, related to all of these, folly. It also influences the minds of generations of people. In the minds of white people, it others people of color. People of color may internalize the villainized or simplified versions of themselves that they see on screen. As Real Indian director Neil Diamond says the first time he rides a horse, "I finally feel like a real Indian." The images of these stereotypes, in this case the Hollywood Indian, overtake the real cultures. In the case of First Nations, they reduce hundreds of cultures to one based on those from the plains, represented by a horseback riding, feather headdress and buckskin wearing warrior. Early filmmakers were fascinated with North America's indigenous peoples and recorded various groups dancing. They were the heroes of the early films, albeit as noble savage stereotypes. However, during the Depression, this shifted, and Native Americans in film were villainized, shown to be brutal and barbaric. They became violent bandits, as seen in the movie Stagecoach, which, according to Ojibwe filmmaker Jesse Wendt, was one of the most damaging films for Aboriginals. Throughout the classic westerns, indigenous peoples are framed as keeping the real Americans from settling their own country. Generations of First Nations people, along with every other minority, have seen themselves villainized and minimized on screen. They are the thieves, rapists, and murderers to be killed by the heroes. Even after death, they are not allowed dignity. As seen in the John Wayne film The Searchers, Wayne and his group unearth a burial site, and Wayne shoots the dead man in the face to prevent him from entering the spirit world. They are framed as irrational, mystical, lazy, stoic, warlike, and overly sexual. They are told, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." Even sympathetic films, including 1930s The Silent Enemy about starvation on reservations, and more modern films, tended to frame Aboriginal people as mythological or like the dinosaurs. In other words, as located in the past instead of as living people. This means that the majority do not have to contemplate the consequences of colonization and, as a byproduct, their current place in Hollywood. As previously mentioned, each racial group has been boiled down to a handful of stereotypes. African American characters were commonly divided into 5 main stereotypes: the coon, who is lazy and jive-talking; Uncle Tom, the docile, faithful slave; Mammy, who is the female equivalent of the Uncle Tom stereotype, as seen in Gone with the Wind, the tragic mulatto, who is often a mixed-race woman who died for the sins of her parents' transgression and for being sexual, and lastly, the black buck, the image of an animalistic, aggressive black man, often shown trying to assault white women. For example, the 1915 film Birth of a Nation, which celebrated the birth of the KKK, featured examples of almost all these stereotypes, mostly played by white actors, and portrays blacks as a threat to white people and families. The main villain, a mixed-race man named Silas Lynch, which is likely significant, lusts after white women and, therefore, it is implied, wants to legalize interracial marriage. The other villain in the film is a black buck stereotype called Gus, who attempts to rape a white woman who kills herself to preserve her honor. African American filmmakers produced a number of films, dubbed race movies, shortly after this and into the 1950s, which at first looked at various issues resulting from racism, such as lynching and light-skinned African Americans passing for white. However, after taking up white backers, they were forced to change the tone of the films to more escapist, with genres such as black westerns, black gangster films, and black musicals. After World War II, the U.S.'s production code limited the use of stereotypes like the tragic mulatto and the black buck, but also the range of black characters to be played, simultaneously allowing the coon stereotype to continue and flourish, as most representations of African Americans in classical Hollywood cinema were unthreatening and almost childish, and therefore comedic. The blaxploitation genre emerged in the 1970s. These films, such as Shaft, featured black men as main characters, but they were often pimps and drug dealers and glorified for being so. It is argued that the type of figure in these films is thus merely an updated version of the black buck stereotype. Black women also had starring roles in blaxploitation films like Foxy Brown, where they beat up white villains. While this is sort of set up as a counter to racism in a weak way, they were very sensationalist and not very deep. However, the 1970s also saw some more serious films starring African Americans, dealing with African American issues like 1972's Lady Sings the Blues. The Asian characters in the first half of the 20th century tended to be either villains, like the inscrutable Fu Manchu, a figure played by many actors, most if not all of them white, or servile workers doing laundry or other basic physical tasks. A common drama of this era was that of a white woman being pursued by an Asian man and often forced into prostitution. This narrative became less common, and films often sought to undermine the masculinity of Asian men. The Second World War ignited brewing anti-Asian sentiment in America, leading to Japanese internment in the interior, with propaganda and other films playing a role. After the war, with communism becoming the major threat, Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese characters became the enemy, while the Japanese were portrayed more sympathetically in films such as Bridge on the River Kwai and Tea House of the August Moon. The rise of kung fu movies coincided with that of blaxploitation films, and the two genres were very similar, both thematically, protagonists of color violently defeating white bad guys, and stylistically, both were very sensationalized. Outside of these films, Asian American actors were still largely limited in the parts available to them, mostly villain or bit parts, at best as the sidekick to a white hero, such as in the Green Hornet TV show. For this reason, many Asian Americans have chosen to go elsewhere for work. Women of color are often portrayed as variations on the vamp or femme fatale trope, and much more heavily sexualized than white women. For example, the Dragon Lady trope, a female version of the Fu Manchu villain, or Pocahontas, who's seen as the embodiment of American desire. Films of the 1960s to the 1980s attempted to combat these film traditions, challenging some stereotypes and casting actors of color in major, if not leading parts. But white filmmakers were often not able to completely put aside ingrained cultural images and ideas. An example of this would be The Color Purple, directed by Steven Spielberg, which is about black women struggling for survival in the South during the first decades of the 20th century, against the black men in their lives who abused them. While this film does draw complex female characters of color from its source material, the novel of the same title by Alice Walker, it also portrays black men as abusive rapists, while the novel focuses on the idea that this violence is the result of the chain of oppression that stems in the first place from white brutality. It also minimizes the protagonist's lesbian relationship present in the book. Later stories dealing with racism, those during and after the Second World War, and especially during the 1980s, such as Pinky or Little Big Man, were told from a white perspective, or with white actors in black, red, or yellowface, because it was thought that the assumed white audience would be able to relate to them more. In other words, they would not be able to understand their perspective otherwise. And thus the films would appeal more to these viewers. This also resulted in films such as Dances with Wolves, featuring the white savior trope. The white hero must teach the helpless natives to defend themselves against their aggressors. Not only is this generally insulting to the cultures presented, it also plays into the racist belief that minorities are more childlike and therefore less intelligent than whites and incapable of handling their own affairs. At the same time, when playing characters that are otherwise flat and stereotypical, actors of color find ways to humanize or undermine these stereotypes, such as Chief Dan George in films like Little Big Man and especially Outlaw Josie Wales, where he brings great humor to the role, seeming to mock some of the stereotypes present. Understanding these stereotypes and practices such as blackface allows us to analyze and criticize their appearances and the portrayal of race in films, their effect on our culture, and the effect on the people they are meant to represent. In doing this, we can work to make the film industry more accessible to actors and filmmakers of color, and make portrayals of racial minorities more complex and reflective of reality. As seen with films such as Smoke Signals, The Fast Runner, and Ang Lee, Wayne Wang, and Spike Lee's independent movies, the best solution in this case is to allow people of color to speak for themselves and to tell their own stories.